We are live, Mayor.
Okay. I am going to call the Planning and Programming Committee meeting for March 25th to order. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We want to start with an approval of the resolution that allows us to conduct this meeting electronically. The resolution is circulated in your packet. Is there a motion to approve the resolution?
And Wheeler will make a motion to approve the resolution.
Motion by Chair Wheeler, seconded by
Snyder, seconds.
Seconded by Councilmember Snyder to approve the resolution. Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is approved. I just want to note we have all the members of the committee in attendance. Welcome, everyone. All right, we're going to move to the summary notes from our March 1st meeting, which are also circulated in your packet. Are there any corrections, amendments, modifications to the meeting minutes from the 1st?
Move to approve, Chair Wilson.
There's a motion by Mayor Rochelle, seconded by
Second by Ann Wheeler.
Seconded by Chair Wheeler to approve the meeting summary from March 1st. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it.
One abstention.
Sorry,
me.
one. And thank you, Mayor Runner. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All right. So that brings us to the next item on our agenda. Sorry, I just completely lost my agenda. There we are. Transportation Technology Action Plan. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jasper.
Thank you so much, Chair Wilson. Members of the Planning and Programming Committee, good evening. Thank you for your time this evening. We're going to be introducing a new topic that's related to what we discussed last month. So this is the action plan that's associated with the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. We want to kind of introduce you to this. So we didn't share this information in advance of the meeting. After this meeting, we will share this presentation and also the draft of the action plan for your further review and comments. Next slide, please, Sheree. Just a few abbreviations here. We can come back to this slide if need be, but we will be talking a lot about committees. So I just wanted to spell out all the acronyms here for you in case you get lost along the way. We can come back to these. We will refer to the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan frequently as TTSP. Otherwise, you probably are familiar with the committee, so I don't really need to spend much time on that, I don't think, but happy to. And also there's a link on this page to find out more information about the committees when we share this after the meeting, if you're interested. Next slide, please. Just a quick recap of how we got here. The Transportation Technology Committee, which is an advisory committee to the Executive Director, was created some 2 years ago now. And over that time, they've been helping staff develop our thoughts on the role of transportation technology in Northern Virginia. That has led to the draft of the TTSP, which we discussed with you and the other committees at your last meeting. And during the March cycle, we have been talking to the committees about the action plan as well. So some of you did attend the 6th annual Northern Virginia Transportation Roundtable earlier this month, and we did have a very interactive mini session on the TTSP, which my colleague Mackenzie Love will talk about in just a moment. And looking forward, we will be coming back to all the committees in the April meeting cycle, seeking a recommendation on the action plan for the authority to take action to approve the action plan at its meeting in May of this year. And immediately after that, we'll begin the implementation of the action plan, particularly focused in the short term on integration with transaction, our long-range transportation plan. I'd also like to just remind everyone on the committee that Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Rochelle, as well as being PPC members, are also members, indeed chair and vice chair of the Transportation Technology Committee, the TTC, which has spearheaded the development of this plan. So with apologies to you two, you're going to hear stuff you've already heard, but feel free to give your perspective as we go. Next slide, please. Wanted to restate here something that the authority approved in December of last year. This is the vision statement for the long-range plan transaction. Northern Virginia will plan for and invest in a safe, equitable, sustainable, and integrated multimodal transportation system that enhances quality of life, strengthens the economy, and builds resilience. I tell my staff that the reason you're paid to come to work or work virtually is to, through our planning and programming efforts, help the authority achieve this vision. And we are encouraging all our committees to have this in the back of their minds as we go through this conversation and future conversations related to transactions, since they all tie together. Next slide, please. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Mackenzie to just kind of touch on a few recap points, and then I'll come back later to close out the presentation after Mackenzie has discussed the action plan with you. Mackenzie, over to you.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, members, for having me this evening. First, I wanted to go over some of the feedback that you have graciously provided us on the draft TTSP, or Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. I want to note that this is just a high-level selection of your feedback, but there was certainly more, and we're documenting all of it and working to integrate it into the next drafts that are forthcoming. One of the things you emphasized was that the TTSP needs to take a needs-driven approach. So that's identifying objectives in the region and working towards how transportation technologies can satisfy them rather than the other way around. You also emphasized that investments should be made smartly as to avoid obsolescence, and requested clarification on how the TTSP will be actualized and to provide more detail about how it will integrate with the long-range transportation plan transaction. And we will get to a bit more detail on that in this presentation and in the draft TTSP action plan that you'll be receiving for review shortly hereafter. We also received recommendations from you about allowing flexibility in the strategies included in the TTSP so that they can adapt and evolve as innovation does, particularly in this region. And I think you'll hear us speak a little bit to how we're incorporating that recommendation in particular in just a couple of slides. But with that, I'd like to pause and see if any of you would like to highlight any of this feedback or anything else, so that we make sure we're putting the correct emphasis on everything that you're providing us.
Okay, are there any comments that folks want to make at this point or additional feedback? All right, I guess I'm not. Continue on, Ms. Lowe.
Thank you. Sheree, if you could take us to the next slide, please. Great. We have been receiving feedback on the TTSP in various formats. Keith mentioned to you earlier that we had the 6th annual Northern Virginia Transportation Roundtable on March 10th. We had over 140 people join us, including 12 members of the authority. So this was an excellent opportunity. The mini session on the TTSP was introduced by NVTA Executive Director Monica Backman. And we also had a few remarks from the Transportation Technology Committee Chairman and member of this committee, Councilmember David Snyder. who emphasized again the importance of planning proactively and making sure we are fully embracing our core values as we move forward with the TTSP initiative. Sheree, if you could take us to the next slide, I'll give you an overview of some of the feedback specific to the TTSP that we received during that event. During the mini session, we used a series of live polls to engage the audience, regardless of if they joined us via WebEx or YouTube, and they were very dynamic experiences, and we appreciated getting that feedback. There were 5 questions, 3 of them were multiple choice, and 2 that you're seeing on your screen encouraged free response. We wanted to highlight those for you because they gave us the most direct and unfiltered feedback from the audience. So the first question was, what innovative approaches can the region take to improve transportation equity in Northern Virginia? And we received over 50 unique responses, which is really exciting. And while they spanned a gamut of suggestions, there were a few common topics that emerged, such as starting engagement around the TTSP, particularly with communities that are historically underserved, by asking questions and listening first. There were also recommendations to provide more services and access to multiple modes, improving safety through investment in infrastructure, exploring the idea of reducing or providing free fares for trips of various modes, and providing reliable and real-time data to the public. And that came with a couple of different perspectives. One was for them to use the services that exist, such as real-time bus information for where the bus is along the route, but also information about what services are available in the region and how decisions are made. The second free response polling question was, which safety needs in Northern Virginia could be addressed by emerging transportation technologies? And we asked the respondents to consider all users and all modes. And again, we had a swath of responses from everything about using technologies to mitigate personal travel behaviors like distracted or impaired driving, to using data to target investments in safety-related infrastructure, encouraging connectivity between modes, and using technologies to mitigate the impacts of crashes, particularly those between vehicles and people who are biking or people who are walking. Sheree, if you could take us to the next slide. Please, we'll go over one final source of feedback that I want to present to you all, and then I'll open the floor to have a discussion and see if you had any questions. During the February and March committee cycles with NVTA, we received a suggestion to reword some of the titles of the strategies in the TTSP. So these are the 8 strategies that you've seen in the materials thus far. And you can see on the left-hand side, these are the current iterations of those titles. And again, those are not ordered in priority or chronological order. They are just for quick the numbers are just for quick reference. On the right-hand side of this table, you'll see how we are recommending to revise those titles. So there are 4 that we're recommending changing, and I will go through each of them and then open the floor to you for any feedback you might have. The first change is to strategy number 1, which is currently titled Reduce Congestion, and we're recommending changing it to Reduce Congestion and Increase Throughput. The next we're recommending changes to is number 3, which currently says maximize cybersecurity and maximize privacy for members of the public, and we're recommending dropping one of those maximize words just to improve flow. So it would be maximize cybersecurity and privacy for members of the public. For strategy 4, it's currently minimize potential for zero occupancy vehicles, and we recommend changing it to minimize potential for zero occupancy passenger vehicles. The reason for this addition is that there are potential use cases for autonomous vehicles to deliver freight or goods such as groceries or perhaps prescriptions, and we don't want to preclude that option. What we intended to target with this strategy was vehicles that could be carrying a human passenger that are not. And so we just wanted to provide that specificity and the direction there. Finally, on strategy 8, it is currently listed as create a network of charging infrastructure for use by private and fleet vehicles. And we recommend changing that to advance decarbonization of the transportation system. The reason behind this recommendation is that strategy 8 was originally focused on electric vehicle charging, which is gaining a lot of traction in the Commonwealth and is still a very valuable option. But there are other alternative fuel sources that may become more valuable and more feasible, or additionally a feasible option, including things such as hydrogen. And we want to make sure that this strategy could adapt to those potential changes and is flexible enough for any other innovative things that might come up. So again, this is making sure that the plan can move forward and remain a living document. With that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions or thoughts on this.
Chair Wheeler.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you. I will tell you, when I first read advanced decarbonization of the transportation system, I assumed, and so the way I interpreted that was that we wanted to cut out cars and we wanted more mass transit. So I understand now when you explained it what you were getting at, but that wasn't what I read when I saw that, just so you know.
Other comments?
There was an article this week on a prototype of a solar automobile in California as well.
Just to clarify that we're not necessarily just looking at only, mass transit, and that's not what that really is gearing itself toward. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair Wheeler. This strategy would look at focusing on electric vehicles, but also providing the opportunity for things like hydrogen in both fleets like transit or government fleets, but also for private personal vehicle use. And that's something we wanted to note in strategy 1 as well, with the addition of increased throughput. We know that particularly during the times of transition for some of these technologies, that we will have current modes, say personal vehicles, and the new innovative and emerging options operating in the same realm. And we need to make sure the system works for all modes in the most efficient and effective manner.
Thank you.
Chair Wilson.
Mayor Rochelle.
Yes, and to address Ms. Wheeler's comments, I can't speak for everyone on the TTC, but speaking for myself, my interpretation of that is that whatever we do must serve the entire transportation infrastructure. That technology has to work for everyone and for every option that we now have, plus whatever might come down to us in the future.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Mayor Rochelle. I mean, I think the goal is to make every mode more sustainable, and I think that's what this is trying to reach at. Other comments or suggestions? Okay, let's move along.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. It's really great to hear all of these perspectives and make sure, we know that the wording here is very important and that it can have different connotations. So thank you for your feedback. Sheree, if you could take us to the next slide, please. Great. So with that, we'll move on to discussing the TTSP's action plan, which is the final component of the TTSP. And you haven't received it yet, but we wanted to give you a brief overview so that you had a introduction on how to interact with the plan and maybe answer any questions you might have about its structure. So what is the action plan? The TTSP is a strategy document, and this component will help us provide tangible routes forward for bringing its goals and objectives to fruition. So we'll discuss what potential actions could be taken, when they might start, particularly what trigger points might there be, and who would be responsible for taking such actions. Additionally, each action suggested must be traceable to at least one strategy, and those are the 8 strategies we just saw on the preceding slide, and include measures of effectiveness so we can monitor progress and make sure we're accountable to achieving these things. Some of those actions might be triggered by external events such as federal or state legislation, which we monitor closely, or market penetration thresholds. And I want to pause there and say that market penetration thresholds could mean a couple of different things, such as we reach a certain percentage of the population using an electric vehicle, or we see that there's a significant use of shared modes throughout the region. So just monitoring what's happening with the acceptance of some of these technologies across our population. Most of the actions in the plan will be initiated by NVTA staff, but not all will be implemented by them. And that's because we recognize that staff and the authority will need to work together to make some of these things happen, and the importance of partnering with regional agencies and entities like you all represented on this call. So most of these things will need to be done in partnership to make them realistic. Finally, the plan will define a monitoring plan and review and update cycle so that we can acknowledge that this is a living document that will keep evolving as innovation does, and will grow over time. Sri, with that, could you take us to the next slide, please? This is an overview of the structure of the action plan. I'll go over this, and I do want to let you know that I'll provide some more specifics on some of these headings on the next couple of slides, but I'll pause after this to see if you have any questions about the structure as a whole. First, the action plan will start with an introduction, and move into strategy-specific summaries. I do want to note for you that in the strategy-specific summaries, the content will focus in on a subset of the 9 roles that are identified in the TTSP. It will focus primarily on authority roles regarding funding, policy, and advocacy, and staff roles around planning. The reason for this is that the other roles identified in the TTSP, which include champion, facilitate, stakeholder, outreach and education, and observer, will be likely undertaken continuously and perhaps serendipitously when use cases arrive. And when we come to a consolidated actions table in just a few slides, you'll get a better visualization of why we focused in this way. But I would, of course, be happy to take any questions you have about it. For each strategy, each of the 8 strategies, we'll provide a brief overview, usually a paragraph or 2, that describes the time frame on which we anticipate the technologies that are associated with it being developed or perhaps entering the market, and then move into a series of assumptions made. And generally that will look like 2 to 5 bullet points, and they will be fairly high level and concern things such as, we anticipate by year X, there will be Y percentage of connected vehicles in use in the Northern Virginia region. Or they could look at things like, we assume by the year Z that COVID-19 will still have impacts on the ways that individuals move around the region or our commuting patterns. So things like that, and they'll be specific to each strategy. But we did want to lay those out to make sure that anyone reading or interacting with the plan can be on the same page as they move forward. Finally,
Mackenzie, how do we intend to vet those assumptions going into this process?
As of now, the assumptions are what was used in drafting the TTSP, what assumptions we made looking to research throughout the region, the Commonwealth, and the country. And we're also looking and we're tracking related initiatives throughout the region in particular to make sure that we're pulling on the best practices throughout the region and what types of forecasts they're using. But we're also looking to our committees to, when they review the TTSP and the action plan, to look over those and give us any feedback that you deem appropriate.
Okay.
So after we've gone over the assumptions, there is a mini action plan for each of the strategy specific summaries. And I'll show you an example of what that will look like in just a couple of slides. Next, we'll move into a consolidated actions table that will take the detailed approach that was in the strategy specific summaries and roll them into one visual representation that can show the synergies between the strategies and also the movement over time. So you can see when actions will be taken and how they could harmonize with one another. Finally, the action plan will discuss next steps, such as its monitoring progress and update cycle, and provide some detail on the review process, which we'll also discuss a little bit later in this presentation. I'd like to pause here and see if there are any more questions about this structure before I go into a little bit more detail.
Any questions? All right. No questions.
Okay, Sheree, could you take us to the next slide? Thank you. So this is an example of what a strategy specific summary would look like. And again, you'll see that overview at the top there, which is again going to be a paragraph or so about what we anticipate the development of the strategy or the timeframes around the strategy to look like. And then a series of assumptions made, and then the mini actions table. I want to go over this in a little bit more detail because it's also relevant to the consolidated actions table that we'll cover next. The first thing you'll notice is that on the far left-hand side of the table is a column called items. There you will see a reference number that will typically look like 1A, 3A, 3B, 3C, and that the number will refer to the number associated with one of the 8 strategies, and the letter will indicate one of the actions assigned to that strategy. Again, this is not chronological or priority order. It's just a reference number for easy access throughout the document. Next, the table talks about responsible party, and usually this is the party that is tasked with initiating the action, and so often it will be NVTA staff. But again, we know that most of these things, if any of them, could be undertaken alone. So there's a column later in the table called stakeholders that will provide a list of persons or entities that would be involved in this action. Next, we move to trigger point. And again, those could be internal, such as a kickoff meeting for transaction, or external, such as the adoption of new federal legislation. And then next, a time frame. And this will be either immediate, near term, midterm, or long term. And in the consolidated actions table, you'll see that we've defined each of those either with calendar years or time increments so that you can know exactly what we're recommending and when. The table will also define current status, and that could be in regards to initiatives and activities NVTA is currently undertaking or other things happening throughout the region or in regards to a particular technology. And finally, the table will indicate a few actions for each sub-actions for each of these, and a metric of success that ties directly to it as well. I will also provide you a few examples of what these could look like. So an action could be incorporate a funding evaluation criteria or project selection criteria that concerns itself with the goals of the TTSP in transaction. And a measure of success could be, was that integrated or was a regional conversation about the topic initiated? With that, Sheree, if you could take us to the next slide, I will describe the consolidated actions table that rolls up all of this detail into one place, and then open it to see if you have any questions or comments to make about the structure or the content. So this is the consolidated actions table that you will see again in the draft action plan. And I do understand there's a lot of information on the screen with very small text. So I'll walk you through the structure of it, then I'll give you an example. And then you can ask me about any other particulars that you would like. So starting from the left, you'll see that there's a column with each of the 9 roles for NVTA that are suggested in the TTSP. And the roles that are bolded are the ones that we will provide the most granularity about in the action plan. And those that are not listed in bold text, you'll see as we walk through the remainder of the table are those that could be undertaken continuously or as needs arise. Next, you'll see that there is a listing of numbers 1 through 8, and those refer to the 8 strategies in the TTSP. And at the cells that represent an intersection between a role and a strategy, you'll see some small numbers there, such as 1A, 1B, 3A, and those refer to the actions that are suggested in the strategy-specific summaries earlier in the action plan. This way you can map exactly how they all relate to one another. As you move across the table towards the right, you'll see that there is a series of time frames at the top of your table, and underneath them, there are a series of color-coded squares that indicate when action could be taken. It also indicates if it's direct action, preparatory action, or follow-up action, or if it's something that could happen continuously or serendipitously. So let me give you one example of how this might look. Strategy 3 is maximize cybersecurity and privacy for members of the public. And you can see that in this third column under applicable strategies. Now, if you follow that down vertically to the funding role, you'll see that there is a little text that says 3A there. Strategy action 3A, if you were to look earlier in the action plan, is increased consideration of cybersecurity and privacy in transaction. If you look over to the right side of the table, you'll see that first dark green square indicates direct action, which corresponds to an immediate time frame and the transaction kickoff meeting just below that. So with that example, I will pause and see if you have any questions about that or anything else covered in this table.
Okay, so this is it was a good explanation of a complicated table. Are there any questions about how the table works? All right, moving along. Thank you.
All right. I also wanted to note if there are any questions about the structure of the action plan or the summaries, I'd be happy to take those as well. But I think if there are no questions, we can move on to the next slide, Sri. And I will hand it off to Keith.
Great, thanks very much, Mackenzie. And if at any point you want to go back to anything that Mackenzie has said, then just please feel free to interrupt. I want to address on the next couple of slides some possible outcomes that might arise in the event that this committee recommends the authority approve the action plan, and then the authority subsequently does that. I would give some examples of the sorts of things that might happen as a result of that downstream from here. So some of the earlier things that we'll be looking at are related to transaction, which, as you know, the authority recently approved the selection of Cambridge Systematics. We're working to have a kickoff meeting with them very shortly, and there'll be quite a bit of work on the analytical side, which will really depend upon what happens with the TTSP and and the action plan. And specifically, we'll be conducting some scenario analysis or sensitivity testing of alternate futures, quite a few related to technology. And we want to make sure that when we do that testing, it's perfectly aligned with the TTSP. So this work will happen hopefully over the spring and the summer. And the sorts of things we're talking about when we say scenario analysis, the sorts of scenarios are listed here as examples. Now, these are not necessarily indicating things we think anyone would prefer to do, or not that we're predicting that they will happen. It's more along the lines of these are things which could possibly happen, and we'd like to know what would happen if they were to do that. So the first one is looking at incentives and pricing mechanisms to reduce car dependency, climate change and resiliency of the regional transportation system, and the pandemic new normal implications for increased work from home and e-commerce. You may recall that in July of last year, we did present the findings of some analysis that we did using exactly this sort of scenario analysis related to COVID-19. And we want to drill down a little bit further into that if that's consistent with the TTSP. The next area of possible outcomes is outreach and education. This, as Mackenzie has already indicated, is something that we're kind of at a base level are already doing in a number of different ways. But I think the approval of the TTSP, or specifically the action plan, will give us new emphasis here. And so one of the things, just as an example, that we could be looking at are helping inform Northern Virginians on facts and myths related to connected, autonomous, shared and electric vehicles. We sometimes refer to those as CASE vehicles, covering a broad range of approaches in the transportation realm, some of which are here or nearly here, some of which maybe are here in pilot form but not in production mode yet, that sort of thing. The next thing you'll be very familiar with is NVTA's legislative program. So there may be some things we'd like to kind of explore further through this action plan and through transaction to consider for potential addition to future legislative programs, such as supporting electric vehicle infrastructure, supporting zero emission vehicles, and expressing concern regarding the potential for zero occupant passenger vehicles, as was noted in the rewording of one of the strategies. The last thing there is the thing which keeps me up awake at night as a transportation planner, is the thought of vehicles driving themselves around Northern Virginia because they can, with no particular purpose, but further congesting this transportation system. So that's something we might want to take a position on at some point in the future. Next slide, please. So continuing on with the possible outcomes, this next series of possible outcomes are looking a little bit further ahead. Firstly, the possibility, once the current transaction update is adopted by the authority towards the end of calendar year 2022, for subsequent funding programs, whether we should be looking to make potential refinements to the project selection process, so things like contingencies or standardization approaches related to technology are the sorts of things that we might want to consider, recommending the authority considers before investing in certain types of projects, that have technology as a component, but are not necessarily, consistent or appropriate for our region. Funding obviously is something over, which is a major, source of leverage for the authority, and transaction, as you all know, is the first filter on eligibility for what the authority can use its regional revenues for. So we've been working with your staff over the last couple of months to begin freshening up the project list that goes with transaction. The last transaction was adopted in October of 2017. So the project list we've been using for recent funding programs and the upcoming imminent one will use that project list from October 2017. Subsequent to November or December of 2022, we'll be using the project list in the yet to be adopted transaction. The important thing here is if there are projects that are relevant, they need to be in this next transaction update, or wait 5 years if regional revenues are sought. Finally, some other areas of potential outcomes relate to future regional transportation policy. We wouldn't be looking to immediately develop or pursue regional transportation policy. We need to be far more circumspect and data driven than that. So we would start with probably white papers on prospective topics for policy, and develop those white papers as we do with everything, collaboratively with your staff and through the committees and ultimately the authority before any policies are actually formally developed and implemented. So there's some of the areas where we see possibilities: shared mobility devices, we see scooters and bike share and so on. The use of autonomous transit shuttles, which both of those things, shared mobility devices and autonomous shuttles, are great first mile, last mile solutions, which, if implemented right, could well offer options to folks whose only choice is to drive and perhaps drive alone. That there might be other options that become available through such approaches. Zero occupant passenger vehicles, again, I mentioned earlier, and human services transportation is something that is kind of not really anything that we've touched on previously, but I think with mindful of the in particular the equity core value, which goes as part of the TTSP and more broadly transaction, this is an area where there may be some additional research that would benefit the region if we were to decide that was a worthwhile thing to do. So just wanted to put that up there as a possibility, nothing stronger than that. I'll pause there. I know, Chair Wilson, at the last meeting you mentioned a lack of clarity from us about how this would kind of actualize, and I hope this might kind of move at your comfort level a little bit further along, by kind of explaining that if the authority does approve this action plan, the sorts of things that might happen as a result.
Yeah, I think this gives me a little bit more flesh on that, and I get it. Yeah, I think this is what I was looking for.
Great, I'm glad it helps. If there are any other comments, I can take a pause here before we round out the presentation very quickly afterwards.
Yeah, are there other questions about the outcomes from the committee? Nope. Okay. Moving along.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So let's just looking ahead then. So we're planning on bringing an action item to the authority in May, which means we're going to vet that through the committees in April. and you know, that's obviously got to be coordinated. So this, what we anticipate asking for recommendations on are the 8 strategies, you know, defined at a moderately high level. You have a document which is quite detailed. We're not looking for you to approve that document. That actually would be, from our perspective, counterproductive, because it would lock us in and greatly restrict flexibility to use the TTSP as a living document that reflects changes, among other things, in the evolution of technology. So we won't be looking to get the document itself approved, just the 8 strategies and approval to begin implementation of the action plan along the lines that I've just outlined on the previous 2 slides. If that approval is forthcoming, in addition, we will be looking to provide an update to the authority and the committees, probably while transaction is under development, for every 6 months, and subsequently probably annually or as needed if some major trigger point occurs, as Mackenzie mentioned earlier. The sorts of things we'll be looking at in those 6-month updates will be any feedback that we've received, progress that we've made, changing assumptions, and any revisions, substantive revisions that we consider are necessary to the strategies or the action plan based on experience in the previous 6 months. Another thing that we would do, and this is closely tied in with transaction, is one thing that we've not done to date with respect to the development of the TTSP or the action plan, is reach out for public to the public for engagement on the public's feelings about how technology might help or hinder their daily lives, and any other thoughts that they'd like us to share. So that won't be, you know, in the first version of this, but as I say, the TTSP is a living document. It will evolve in response to multiple things, and we would like to get the public engagement. So we envision that engagement will occur during spring and over the summer. So not long after the approval of the recommendations, that we will begin public engagement as well. And that will obviously be the subject of certainly the first and possibly the second update that we bring to you. Next slide, please. Next steps. Just kind of very quickly, I know this is a short turnaround, and we do have flexibility on this. If there are any kind of further thoughts that you have subsequent to this meeting and a first glance at the action plan that we'll send out to you tomorrow, you know, we would appreciate any feedback you can give us by the end of the month or early in April. It's kind of a rolling feedback process, but if there's anything significant, it will be helpful for us to have that sooner rather than later, because we'd like to share a final draft of the TTSP and the action plan in early April. We're looking at probably the first committee we go to will be the Technical Advisory Committee, which meets on the 3rd Wednesday. We'd like to give that committee, at least a week to review the final draft. So somewhere between the end of this month and the middle of early to middle of next month, we need to kind of turn around all the final comments and push out a final draft. That's not to say you can't still comment on it as we go through April, but we'd like to give everyone the same document to review. We would be looking to kind of bring recommendations to this committee on a date which is currently TBD. I think Shri has some ideas to suggest what might work best within the overall cycle. Typically, this committee is the last committee to consider a recommendation before it goes to the authority. In theory, depending on exactly the timing and Ms. Backman's packet distribution date, there may be time to kind of run even into early May for the next PPC meeting, but we'll come back to that in a while. And in fact, I misspoke. The TAC will meet on the third Wednesday, but in fact, I think we're going to have the TTC meeting a couple of days before that. So the TTC will go first, and then the statutory and standing committee will follow. I think there is one more slide which I can leave up, which is the sorts of feedback that we're requesting, which is similar to what I said at this point in the last meeting. So with that, I'm happy to take any further questions or comments or feedback, and obviously Mackenzie is available to field those as well. Thank you.
Okay, other comments, particularly on other groups that they should seek feedback from? Are there any suggestions?
Chair Wilson?
Chair Wheeler.
It's not so much what other groups. So I was thinking, Mackenzie does a great job of explaining some of those more detailed, complicated issues when we're going through. And I'm just wondering how a document is going to be able to translate when you put it out to the public without a lot of detailed explanation of some of the things that she was so good at explaining. Like,
are you
orally.
suggesting that Mackenzie do a YouTube video for?
I don't know. I'm thinking that it would be difficult for me just to pick up something and try to sort of sort through it. And so I know that they're probably going to have to do a lot of work on that. I'm just sort of saying that out loud because it is easier when she explains it.
Chair Wilson, if I may respond to that.
Yes.
That's an excellent question. It's one of the reasons why we haven't gone to the public yet, is because this is such a conceptual, complex, and in many ways nebulous thing to ask for comments on. And it does require a lot of explanation to do what we're trying to do with this and the other committees. I think when it comes to public engagement, I'd say a couple of things. First off, we've hired a great consultant with a great public engagement team. So it's going to be their job to figure out how to get the information in the most effective way from the public. So yeah, the communication, from us to them and the engagement and feedback back to us is something that's got to be thought through very carefully. I would say we would not likely be doing it in this way. I think we're more likely to be doing it in a way which, for those of you who have participated in the polling for the mini session of the roundtable recently, we'll probably look at some interaction on very specific points to kind of get the public to scale or rank certain factors that are important to them, or that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean it's challenging, but it actually works very well for us. With we would be doing engagement with the public anyway through transaction, and so this will just get rolled into that, and there are much smarter brains on that team than I have in my brains, and so we're going to rely heavily on the experts to advise us how to do this effectively.
Thank you.
This is Schneider. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So in order for people, even on the authority, to understand what's going on here, I think we're going to need to take a technology or technologies and run it through the plan and then run it through the transaction plan. It's probably a great planning document, but only a certain portion of the world are planners. The others of us are more implementers. So I think people are going to want to know, what am I really voting for? What does this really mean in the real world? How is this going to fit in with project selection criteria and process? I think those are the kinds of questions that I think we're going to need to ask, so that people really understand what it is they're voting on and what role it will play in the future. I don't know, others may disagree, and I respect that, but as I've listened to the second presentation of this, it's also fundamental to go back to the three key core values that are NVTA core values, but especially drove this work, which are safety, equity, and what was the third one?
Sustainability.
Sustainability, yes. How could I forget? Nothing intended there, except it's late in the day. But do you see where I'm going with that? To help, like if I were presenting this to the authority, I would want to say, this is the potential role it will play, so that authority members have a sense about what it is that they're voting on.
If I may respond,
Yeah.
Chair Wilson, I think the suggestion from Councilmember Snyder is excellent and on point. I personally have been grappling with this for a couple of months, kind of knowing how we normally submit staff reports to the authority to explain a topic and to help everyone understand what the issues are and the basis for the recommendations that we're making. And so I mean, I have been thinking about this for, as I say, for a couple of months. But I think if I may make a suggestion is that perhaps Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Rochelle as well, if you're both agreeable, is that perhaps we can work with you offline to kind of road test or pilot test an approach along the lines that you're suggesting, so that we can accomplish what it is that you're suggesting effectively. I mean, it's obviously very important, as you say, to communicate this, and it is a complex thing. We've never done a strategic plan like this before, and it is something which is a moving target as well. So I think if that's acceptable, and perhaps Monica might also want to weigh in here as well, that's perhaps one approach we could adopt.
Thank you, Keith, and Chair Wilson, if I may. Mr. Snyder, thank you for those remarks, because this is a highly technical document and we need to be able to convey it, and no pun to anyone, in layman's terms, so people can know what the document means. What do these strategies mean? What are we trying to achieve? Now, right now, because we would like authority approval so we can roll a lot of this work into transaction, it's particularly on the components that the authority will have some autonomy over. I think we can break it down to a more micro level, but a lot of this will be engulfed in your long-range transportation plan. So once we get to the tail end of that plan, that's when we'll start to see some of the outputs and how some of this impacts the road network, some of what we're proposing, getting to what will we actually get once some of the modeling work and things of that nature has transpired. As Keith noted, we're looking at doing scenario analyses as part of this transaction update. And I even think that's another measurement point to really see how these strategies and the implementation thereof, if you will be performing. So I think we can definitely have a high level discussion with the authority on what this would mean in regards to, more clean vehicles on the road, less fossil fuels and things of that nature. But to get to a more micro level, I do think a lot of that will be encompassed in the long range transportation plan update.
Does that address your concerns, Councilmember Snyder?
Yeah, I think it does. And folks, please feel free to disagree, but I think in addition to the plan itself, I think you'll get a question, well, what does it mean? Or what's the real world impact? How is it gonna affect the whole process from the transaction plan to particular projects? And I think it's intended to inform and make sure that technology is something we include in all of our thinking from the ground up to NVTA authority, and that it be regional so that you don't have one kind of thing over here and, oh gee whiz, it doesn't connect to something over here. One could think, for example, in approaching the congestion reduction criteria, that you could, for example, support a region-wide vehicle-to-vehicle technology or infrastructure to vehicle technology that would have a lot of positive aspects on reducing congestion on the highways, for example. Monica, I'm just throwing that out. I'm probably getting way ahead, but in the transit
Yeah.
world, there are other sorts of applications. In the communications world to the public, there are different applications. And then there are the between modes applications, so that the idea is that technology serves the larger goals in transaction and the particular projects that come through for approval under transaction. At least that's kind of my conceptual
Right.
framework.
No, and I think you're spot on, Mr. Snyder. And I would note, I think McKinsey gave an example either at the TTC or last night at the PCAC regarding I-95 and some of the, I think the Commonwealth had a pilot program with Virginia Tech looking at some of the technology on the roads to account for the electric vehicle, or I shouldn't say electric, autonomous vehicles and some of the infrastructure needs that would be required to have autonomous vehicles on I-95, but making sure that it's safe, that it's efficient, but looking at not only the vehicle, but just some of the, and I dare say infrastructure, but they were looking at things like the vest that workers were wearing, or some of the implants in the roadway, some of the signals, some of the, I don't want to say gadgets because that's not the correct word, but just some of the technology components that can go on overhead signs and things of that nature to interact with the autonomous vehicles. They were doing a pilot on 95, but we can talk about specific instances, and then we can go at a larger measure talking about what this would mean when we get to the 6-year program. Because again, I think looking at everything on a federal scale, looking at the way the Commonwealth is going, is particularly from this most previous or most current session with the bills on electric vehicles. Technology is something that we're all going to have to grapple with and make sure we're integrating and accounting for carefully. We don't want to be in a position where we're funding projects and now things are outdated and the useful life cycle hasn't been materialized. So I think there are a lot of examples out there that we can show the authority of what is possible, but we'll know or have a better picture once we are further in the transaction update process.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions, other feedback? Mayor Rochelle?
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. I think there are those on the ground, very practical examples that we can be presented to the authority. And I think Councilmember Snyder is right when he, in the past, he says we're not going to be chasing technology. Technology has to work for transportation, and I think he's absolutely right on that. And that will, I think the authority will understand that and will appreciate not only the high level, the core values that Mr. Snyder articulated, but also the on the ground examples that Ms. Backman will present. And I'm not sure in between how much of that we can get across, like how is this going to fit into the evaluation process. I don't think that probably would not be a productive discussion, because we're going to be so far out in the weeds that we might lose people. But then I leave that up to Ms. Backman's judgment on that. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Other feedback? All right. Let's move along. Does that conclude the presentation on this? Yes, there's a thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. That was, I think I better understand how it all fits together. I think some of this is going to be, until we see it in action, you won't quite appreciate the way it acts as a framework for all these other things. But and I think it's that level of abstraction that makes it a little bit more difficult to kind of wrap your head around. But I think seeing it come to reality, I think is going to help everyone understand that. All right, that brings us to the transaction update, and that's back to Mr. Jasper.
Actually, not much to say. We're on the threshold of the kickoff meeting, and everyone is ramping up to hit the ground running and to keep running for 2 years.
All right, the marathon. You're getting ready to start the marathon. That's
At sprint speed.
All right, all right. I'm a marathoner. You gotta pace yourself. You start
Okay.
reasonable. All right. Next up is the NVTA update, and we're turning it over to Ms. Backman.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. I would note that your packet will be distributed next Thursday. We do have one presentation, which is the economic impact analysis of NVTA funded projects. The authority did approve the budget for us to look at an updated economic impact analysis of the funded projects. We did this exercise a few years ago, but now with the most recent 6-year program that you adopted, the FY 2020 to 2025, we did want to update that information. We have several action items on the agenda, but the primary action items are the approval of the authority's 3 budgets. We have the FY 22 Regional Revenue Fund, which is the 70% revenues, the FY 2022 Local Distribution Fund, which is the 30%, and then the FY 22 operating budget. The authority's Finance Committee did recommend unanimous approval for the authority, so they will be on the agenda for your consideration. The other item I wanted to note under action is approval of the FY 2027 CMAQ and RSTP funding recommendations. If you recall, it was pulled from your March agenda item. We pulled it because we were informed that we had to go in and make additional reductions to the tune of $60 million, because when the FAST Act was extended, it did not account for growth in those programs. So we met with the Regional Jurisdiction and Agency Coordinating Committee earlier today. They made a recommendation for authority approval. We talked to all of the localities and agencies on how to account for those reductions. So you will see that item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Any questions on that for Ms. Backman? All right. That is our final item on our agenda today. Are there any other updates from anyone else? All right, we are scheduled to meet again on Monday, May 3rd, which seems like a long time away, but it's not. Does that date still work for everyone? All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Can we look at our calendars? I just.
You want to do it now, or you want to follow up with staff separately?
Oh, okay. No, that's fine.
It's up to you. I mean, we can all pause and look at our calendars if we want. I'm happy to do it. So. I saw it a little bit ago, and so I checked, but I think I'm okay. But...
Will it be the 5 o'clock period again? Because that's our regular council meeting night.
Yeah, it's on the calendar for 5 p.m. I have a budget work session that night as well, but we don't start until 7. So.
Okay.
Yeah, it's open.
Did Councilmember Snyder have a problem with? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think Councilmember Snyder had a meeting that night, but so he was asking if it was 5 p.m. or not.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's fine with me. Thank you.
It's fine with me.
Yeah. Same time, same bat channel. Okay.
All right. All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second by Councilmember Snyder. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay. The ayes have it. Have a great evening, everyone. I will see you again next year. So thank you.
Okay.